Okay, good morning, everyone. This is Matt Iben with the Office of CAD and Mapping. Today's webinar will be talking about superelevation, and I'm just going to pause here for a second. If everyone could just make sure they have their microphones muted, even if you were calling in on the phone. I was trying to mute some. There was some background noise a little bit ago, but that would be helpful. So as I said, today we're going to look at superelevation. And as usual, this session will be recorded and posted on the wiki page later. So we have some the typical slides that we've been using or showing in some of these webinars. This one has the upcoming trainings that are available. Next week is the ORD overview training, and I'm not sure what we capped out the number of folks that could participate in that, but I think there was 12 or 13 people already signed up for that. As usual, we have the wiki page where we'll organize all the content that we create and post it there. These CAD webinars have their own section there that you'll find the recordings, and we've also been posting the PowerPoint slides for the last few there. So we're getting towards the end of the year. We have today's session on superelevation. Next month, JD will be talking about drainage, and then December will be our open topics session. So if you have any ideas, you'd like to see something, please let us know. I think we really only have one suggestion to this point, so that may be what we go with. And then going into next year, I'm assuming we'll continue the same type of format. So if you have ideas for topics that you want to see on those type of on next year's webinars, feel free to let us know what you'd like to see there as well. The bi-monthly sessions have been canceled for now. And the day after the November's webinar, we'll also have the internal CAD meeting, or CAD Managers User Group meeting, so on the 18th. And I think invites have been sent out for both of those meetings next month. And then the beginning of December, we'll have our next statewide CAD user group meeting available or open to all externals. So. Okay, so I know everyone's probably burnt out on OTEC presentations over the last couple of weeks. So my goal was to try and keep this as short and sweet, not dig into the weeds too much. And really to make sure that we're done in time for the 10 o'clock OTEC session, which we should be, and we should have time to spare there as well. But as I worked on a demo, it ended up being a little bit longer than I had anticipated. So, but we'll get through this. It should be shouldn't be maybe 50 or 60 minutes at the most. And then when I was trying to decide what to present and how to present it, I looked at what we had already had created. And really, this stuff was essentially today's webinar. JD and Eric did a nice job putting these the guides together and the videos together, but I really didn't want to just regurgitate the same things that you could review on your own. So we'll take a look at a few key topics and a demo using a different data set than the training guides. And this slide here, I just wanted to highlight all of the different resources that we already have created. And each piece of text on this slide is a link to that session or that topic on the wiki page. So if you want to refer back to this PowerPoint later, you'll have all those stuff in one place. So here we'll look at just a high-level overview of the steps to incorporate superelevation into your design and your model. Using the federated model workflow that ODOT encourages, we'll want to create a new DGN file for our superelevation using the Create Design Files app, and that'll be the KS file code. And this will be created using a 2D design seed file. So just like you would create any other base map, or most other base maps, we'll use the 2D file or seed file. And then at a minimum, of course, you would need to have your geometry created, and then we'll attach that BK file to our KS file. You don't necessarily have to have your corridor created or modeled at this point. As long as you know what your typical section is going to be, you can create the super elevation lanes from that. But if you have a corridor started, you might as well attach it just as a visual reference. Anyways, you'll find that that's probably helpful to see things better. When working with most of the files in ORD, you'll usually want to attach the existing terrain files and set that terrain as active, which in turn ORD will then create the 3D model for you. That's not needed here. The 3D model will be created when we create the super elevation sections. Of course, you could attach the terrain if you wanted, but it's not a requirement to do your super elevation. And once we've created our super file and attached our references, we'll use ORD commands to create the super elevation sections. And generally, there's going to be one section per curve set. And it's not a cross section by any means. It's just a horizontal section of the curve set. So it'll be a boundary that'll go around each curve. So once we get those sections created, we'll elevation lanes, and these will be just color-filled shapes based on the width and the offsets from the baseline. So if you worked with Super and Geopack SS2, it's a similar concept to that, not exactly the same. And it's sort of really the same process as you might have used with SS4. So, and really the whole thing is the same process as SS4. After we've created our lanes, we'll then calculate the super transitions. And we have this configured to use the AASHTO method 5 as defined in LND. If you've already done the calculations, you can import those rather than doing a bunch of edits to what ORD generates. That may be more time consuming than it's worth. So if I had to guess, most designers are going to prefer to import their own calcs. So we have that option available. We're not necessarily going to look at that today, but at the same time, maybe you're early on in the design process and you just want to get the general sense of what kind of impacts applying the super elevation to your project or your grading and construction limits might be. The ORD calcs will get that done for you real quickly. After the transitions are created, we'll be able to review and edit those calculations done by the software. And in all likelihood, as I mentioned, you'll probably want to or already have created your own calcs. And I would highly recommend checking all of these calcs done by the software and not just trust what it's spitting out. It's not that I don't trust the software, but it's probably just a good engineering practice. And of course, you'll probably want to or need to adjust some of the locations of the transitions, maybe how much of the transition happens within the curve or off of the curve and those sorts of things. So we have that ability to make some modifications after it's done. And if you have an auxiliary lane or an add lane or decel lane or maybe a turn lane, we can add those lanes later. And in my example, I'm going to show the addition of an auxiliary lane or a third lane widening here. So we'll take a look at that here in a few minutes. And then finally, we'll assign the super elevation to a corridor. Again, if you already have your corridor started, you can do that right away. If you've created your super elevation first, obviously you would then need to go back and create your corridor, and then you can assign the super to the corridor. So. In most cases, you'll probably want to create and see some preliminary construction limits before you start thinking about your super elevation. So naturally, you'll want to build your templates to be used in a corridor. And for the super elevation to work, the points you want to control must have a super elevation flag applied to them. So this will tell ORD which points to consider when we do the calculations. And in the ODOT predefined backbones and pavement build-up components, we already have the super elevation flags on for the appropriate points. But you'll still want to check and consider those, if those are applicable to your project. And if you're making modifications to that, maybe you're adding a lane or removing a lane from the template, you'll want to make sure that they still work and the flags are still uh, applied to each point. And then if you do build your own templates from scratch, you'll need to make sure you toggle on the super flag where appropriate. So in that screenshot there, I just showed you where to find it. And in this particular example I showed, I pointed or just drew a circle around each point that has a flag tied to it. So here I just wanted to show how to review the points that have the super elevation flag. So just double clicking on a point opens the properties where the super flag can be toggled on or off. And then if we change to the active template tab of the corridor editor, or excuse me, the template editor, we'll see the different catalogs here or categories. And just by selecting the super elevation folder, you'll see that all the points there are highlighted. And then, so that's a quick way to check all of those. And then of course we can go and review each point individually. You should also be familiar with figure 301-8. So I'm assuming if you're on this call, you probably are. Along with the pavement in the lanes, we'll also need to account for the shoulder breakovers and the rounding that will be done all within our template. So we have, I just included a portion of that figure here, but we have the 7% max breakover. So as long as we're less than 6%, the pavement cross slope, the shoulder slope will vary from 4% to 1%. Once we get greater than that 6%, we'll need to introduce some rounding there. So we'll accomplish this by adding or assigning rollover values or locks to the rounding point within the shoulder. So on the rounding point for both the inside and outside shoulder of the divided highway template that I'm going to use here today, we have a rollover value assigned to these points. So these are also defined in the ODOT predefined shoulder build-out components. So you really shouldn't need to define all this stuff yourself. But if you have a need to, or you want to edit these, you'll just need to click the rollover values button. Open the rollover point properties dialog box. So I'm not going to look at this or spend any time talking about this, but feel free to review all those values there and understand what's happening when you get there. So that's kind of a whole another topic for another day. So this is one of the, or part of the template that I'm going to use in my demo here coming up. And what we can look at is what happens when we test the vertical point control for each lane. So as the pavement cross slope changes, the shoulders are adjusted accordingly. When it gets greater than 6% on the high side, you'll see that the rounding is introduced. And then same thing on the other lane there. Okay, so now we'll take a look at a demo here of a 2-lane divided highway data set. It's not really a real project, but it is a real, it was a project I found on District 6's project-wise folders. So I sort of took the base data set there and just created a demo for this example. So, and I also just wanted to do something different than the dark 185 examples that we typically use. I think I need to reshare my screen here. sorry. Make sure I include the audio. Okay, so let's take a look at adding Superelevation to this short little highway realignment that I've created here. And this is just a sample data set, so take it for what it's worth. It may not be completely correct in all the design assumptions, but it just meant to get the point across for today's demonstration. So what I have here is a divided highway. This is Interstate 71, and I've gone ahead and realigned the 2-lane section. And through the middle here, I've added an auxiliary lane. I'm not sure if you can see that really. So I open up a new lane here. And then by the time I get to this third curve, I have that tapered back in so that we can match existing. So again, just for the demo, but what we want to do here is I'll just take a look at the template since we were talking about those earlier. So I have a 2-lane divided highway or depressed median section here. And I also went ahead and created a second template for my third lane or my add lane here. And what we looked at earlier was when we move these edge of pavement points, the shoulder breakover will change as needed. And in this case, because I've added this other lane, lane point, nothing happens to my shoulder. But if I go ahead and move this edge of pavement line or edge of pavement point, the same thing is still happening with my shoulder breakover that we were talking about earlier. So we really don't need to do much else with this when we're looking at our super elevation or creating our shapes and calculations. So that said, this was a brand new file, so there's no elements in it. I went ahead and attached my geometry file and my KM file, my model that I had already created. And then I'm also using the Bing aerial image for a background map. So just to kind of give an idea where we were at, and that this sort of was a true world situation, or as close to it as we can get for a demo purpose. So I'm going to turn this off at this point just to make things a little easier to see. And again, turn on my BK file. So I have my existing alignment here, and I also have my proposed alignment here on the kind of the east side of the project. And generally we would separate those or federate those. So our existing would be in one BK file and the proposed would be in a separate. Just for the sake of the demo, I just put them together just to save a little bit of time. So I can turn that on or off as needed. I will need, at a minimum, I need my geometry file attached to create my super elevation. I did go ahead and attach my KM file just as a more of a visual reference than anything else. So I will want to know where my lane tapers began and ended. So when I get to adding this auxiliary lane in. So that's why I did that. You don't necessarily have to do that. You could create these, as long as you knew your typical section, you could create these sections without it, or the lanes that we'll create. So I'm going to turn that off for now. And before we get started, I do want to point out that we do not really need to attach a terrain to this file. Generally with ORD, one of the first things you're going to do when you create any new file is attach your terrain or your CADD file and set that terrain as active. We don't necessarily need to do that. And when you set that terrain active, it's going to go ahead and create the 3D model for you. So we don't necessarily need to do that. One of our first steps when we create our super elevation sections is that it's going to go ahead and create a 3D model here. So you are free to do that if you wish, and you can, you know, if you want to see that terrain as you're working through here, you can, but it absolutely is not necessary. So, all right, so from the open roads modeling workflow, we'll go to the corridors tab. And as with many of these commands or many of these workflows, we're working left to right. So I've already created my corridor and my template. And made some edits here, so adding that third lane. And I don't really have anything going on there, but then we have the super elevation group. And so let's take a look at some of these. There's not a whole lot here, so that helps make it fairly straightforward when we're looking at this. So under the create menu, we have create super elevation sections. And what that's going to do is create a horizontal group or a section for each curve. It's not really a cross section by any means. It's just a horizontal section for each curve or each curve set. And then we have create super elevation lanes and create lanes by road template. So the first one was actually how you would create the lanes or build them manually. So if you knew your typical section, we could create the lanes one by one. And if you have a bigger corridor, you may want to go ahead and use lanes by road template. So that'll read the template that we were just looking at and put the lanes in there that way. You're free to do whichever one you feel like might be easier for you to do. And let me see, if I click on create super elevation lanes, you'll see here's some of the parameters that you can set. You can set the name of each lane. You can set the side that it is from the center line, and then you'll set the inside edge offset value, the width, and a normal cross slope. And you could build those for each lane. The reason I point that out is when we go and we use the create lanes by road section, it's going to name the lanes by the point names. So if you create them manually, you can give them names that make sense to you. So you could say lane 1, lane 2, or northbound lane 1, or right lane 1. So you can give those names that make more sense to you. If you do it by road template, it'll give them names based on the point names. So that may also be advantageous because you can see which points that those are all referenced to. So we'll start by sections, and then we'll add lanes to those sections by one of those two workflows. And then once we create those, we'll calculate our super elevation and do some editing there. And we can also import super elevation. So if we create, or if you create your own calculations prior to getting to this point, and you just want to go ahead and use those rather than what ORD is going to calculate for you, you can import that. And we have a separate supplemental video on the wiki page for that. So go ahead and take a look at that. We're not going to talk about how to do that today, so because it's already covered there. So we would assign the super elevation to our corridor file, and we would actually do that in the KM file itself. So we'll attach our super elevation DGN file or KS file to that KM file, and we would assign that there. And then lastly, the last couple commands we have is we can insert a station cross slope, and we're not going to look at that today, but we will look at the super elevation editor. And we'll have a report function that will generate some different reports that we can look at. And then lastly, we have open super elevation views. So similar to the profile view and cross-section views that you've probably worked with, we can open a super elevation view so we can look at the diagrams there. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look. So I'm going to start with create super elevation sections. And I'm going to leave these parameters kind of what you see on the screen already. And I'm going to just leave name as a section. And then my minimum tangent length is, you can play with this value. I'm going to leave it for 0 for this demonstration. But if the tangent distance between two adjacent curves is less than the specified value here, the two curves and the adjacent tangent would be included in one single superelevation section. If the distance between two curves is greater than this value, each curve and half of the tangent would be included into each superelevation section. And then if this value is larger than the total length of the alignment, a single superelevation section would be created for the entire alignment. I just want a single section for each curve set in this case. So I'm just going to leave this at 0, and you'll see what it's going to create. If you want to look at those definitions there, what I was just sort of reading there was straight out of the ORD help. So if you want to refer to the help for this minimum tangent length and what changing that value will do, go ahead and look at the help menu there. All right, so and then my lane creation method, I'm actually going to not use either one of these at the moment. I do want to create my lanes by my template. As soon as I create the section, it's going to prompt me into the next command that we looked at here. So I have template or manual, and what I'm going to do when I get to that point is reset so that I can come back and I'll select one of these. But I'll leave it at template for now. And then my feature definition is superelevation. And then I'm just going to use the default name that's placed in there. So a data point to accept my name, and then I need to identify or locate my alignment here. And now I want these sections, I just want to start to end, so I'll lock that to the start, lock that to the end, and data point to accept. And my minimum tangent length is going to be 0. I'll data point there. And my lane creation method is template. So here we'll see that, and at this point, if I had selected template as I did, you see it's prompted me from my template. Right now, I'm just going to reset to exit out of this command, and then I'll come back and add those lanes here in a second. So we'll see that each curve has been created a superelevation section, and that's what each one of these is. And it's created with this boundary box here. So we'll want to, and all these other commands that we're going to look at, you will want to identify each of these sections. So you want to make sure to leave this level turned on, and you'll want its data point to select those. One thing I haven't figured out is this is great if you're on a 2-lane highway or a 3-lane undivided section or a typical section, because this boundary area is wider than the project. But in this particular example, you'll see that my superelevation sections fall right in the middle of these lanes. I'm not sure if there's a configuration variable or some way we can define that to be larger, but that's something that we probably should look in or ask Bentley to maybe fix. So if we have these turned on or have our corridor turned on or other references, you may find that these sections will get lost in some of those elements. So just by hovering over them, you can usually find them, or kind of by looking at the middle or selecting the middle here, we can usually find those pretty easily. Okay, so we have a superelevation section for each one of our curves. And now we need to go ahead and build those lanes that we looked at. And as I said, one other thing here is, I'm not sure if you noticed when I created this, I just had a design model, or I was talking about that earlier. When I go ahead and created these sections, then a 3D design was created for us. So we don't have to create that manually. It's done automatically for us in the background once these sections are created. So now that I've talked about that, I can finally close that dialog there. Okay, so now we'll go back to create, and I want to go ahead and just create my superelevation lanes by road template. And it's prompted me to select the sections that I want to use. So I'll select all 3 of these. And you can do them one by one if you chose, and then I'll reset to complete. Now it's prompted me for my template, and I could come in and find which one I wanted if I needed to. So I'm going to use my I-71. And when I do that, then I have 2 lanes in each direction that are created for me. I could have identified the lanes manually, or I guess I could have created the sections based on my template drops if I wanted to, but I ran the 2-lane template all the way through, even though I know I have an auxiliary lane that I've added here. So I'll show how to add that here in a second, but first we need to calculate the super elevation before we add that. So these are just 2D filled shapes at this point. There's no real super elevation applied to them. So the next thing we need to do then is calculate the super elevation. So looking at the parameters here for our super elevation calculations, we'll need to define a rules file or load in a root file. If it doesn't, if ProjectWise does not already default to the folder location, you'll find that in the OHDOT standards under the standards and super elevation folder. And ProjectWise does not filter it by the correct extension by default. So we're looking for an XML file. So if we change that, we can choose the OHDOT divided or undivided, and I'm going to use divided here. And then our super elevation selection here is our Emax. We're going to choose, in our case, 8% based on figure 202-7. And our L selection will just be ashtos. That's our only choice that we have here. And we have a design speed of 75 miles an hour. And then the pivot method will have, we have several different options we can look at. This drop-down menu is a little hard to get to. So we can choose how we want to rotate it. So if we have a 2-lane section, we may just want to rotate it on the crown, on the inside edge, the outside edge, left lane, right edge. And here what we want is this divided inside pivot method, and that's based on the figures of 202-5 from the L&D. Then lastly, we'll toggle on the open editor so we can take a look at some of the so that the editor will open as soon as the calculations are complete. So again, I need to select each section I want to apply the super elevation to. So I'm going to select all 3 of those, and then I'll reset to complete this. And then I'll just accept each one of these prompts that I've already set in the dialog box. Okay, so now my super elevation editor appears, and this is where we can review the super elevation, and you have that super elevation diagram here, which if you didn't want to review that, we could toggle that off. And then looking at the left side here, we have we can select each section that we created in our plan view there. And then you could come in and create or modify any of these values at this point if you wanted to. If you wanted to create your super elevation using this workflow, but you've already calculated it and you want to maybe make some edits here, you can do that. Any field that's grayed out, obviously, you won't be able to change. Like for example, in this case, this full super value is the full super value here is dependent on the full super value here. And then you have some of these pivot edges and point types. So some of those you may end up wanting to change at some point. And I'll actually look at changing one of the point types here for our auxiliary lane once we add that. And one thing to point out here is you can filter out what is shown. So if you only wanted to see the left 2 lanes, we could apply that or filter those out. So we're only looking at that. There's really no way to click on these points and edit them in this view. So you would need to make all your edits in the editor box below. Okay, so once I close the editor here, you will see that the lanes that we had now have some different colors applied to them, and they're shaded in. based on the superelevation values. So we can see here, oops, I'll look at the second curve set going on the northbound side here. So we can see these green is my normal section, and green and yellow are my normal cross slopes, I should say. And then the white area is where I'm beginning to transition, and you can see the green changes to blue. So as we transition into the solid blue, that's our full super. And then we begin to transition out of this full super and back to our normal cross slopes. So we can also review these in plan view by selecting a lane, and we can see where the cross slopes change. And we can see that at this point we're in full super at 8%. And we can look at the beginning of the lane, and we can see the station value there and the cross slope. And just like anything else, you could change these right here if you wanted to do that as well. We can also select the actual section, and all of the values for all of the lanes within that section will appear. So you can review everything at once. Maybe we needed to zoom in here and we wanted to change this normal cross slope section or modify this 0 point here. So you can also, well, we'll look at that here in a second when we add our auxiliary lane. But if you grab one of the manipulator handles, we can move where that that lane is. We want to move it up station or down station, we can do that as well. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add in our auxiliary lane here. So as I'll turn on my corridor model here, and let me just turn off a couple levels just to make it a little bit cleaner. Turn off the ditch lines. There we go. Okay, so I want to add in an auxiliary lane here from where I open this up to all the way to the end where I tie back into where my lane taper ends there. So I'm going to create a super elevation lane, and I'm going to leave this as right lane 3, and I'm going to be on the right side, obviously, and my inside offset here is 66 feet, and I have a lane width of 12 feet wide and a normal cross slope of 1.6%. So in order to do this as an auxiliary lane, we can only do one section at a time. So I'm going to select this section, and I don't want to select a second section. So when I do that, then I'm prompted for which type of lane I want to add. So my options here are primary and auxiliary. So I want to make this an auxiliary lane. And when I do that, the application type is what I want to look at. And I want to make sure that I set this to follow adjacent. Okay, so now I'm going to reset, and then I'll data point here to accept all of these other parameters here. Okay, so now it's asking me where I want to start it. And here I'm going to go ahead and just use the smart AccuSnap and snap to the beginning of this where my taper begins. And because I want this then to end at the other end of the section, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to lock this to end. So that way it'll be locked at the same station as my super elevation section is. So data point to accept. And when I do that, you can automatically see the colors of this lane match the adjacent lanes that we did. If you had selected that as a primary lane, you would not be able to build, it wouldn't pull the super that was already calculated over to that lane there. So now I need to repeat this in my other section for this last curve here, where my curve tapers back into, or excuse me, my lane widening tapers back into the 2-lane section. So I'll select the third curve and I'll reset. And here I'm going to make sure I change this again to auxiliary and follow adjacent. And I'll do the same thing. Just data point to accept all of these parameters. And then here I'm going to go ahead and lock this to the start. So it'll lock the begin station to the the section there, section 3. And for the end, I can zoom in and I'll just snap it to the end of where this lane tapers back to 2 lanes. Okay, so when I added this one, you'll notice that the full super value here doesn't exactly match, or the color doesn't match. So when I select on this, it's gone ahead and added this at 1.6%. So I don't really want that there. The other thing you may have noticed is that there's no way to assign a width or taper the width of the lanes themselves. So we'll just assign these all at 12 feet wide, or maybe if it's on a ramp, 16 feet wide. That's really all we need to do. We don't really need to worry about these lanes being matching the actual lane widths, especially in this taper area. Okay, so now what I want to do is go back to my editor, and I'm going to go ahead and just select this section, and we'll see when we look at our diagram here, this blue line here is my right lane that I added. So we'll see that this endpoint is not really what it to be. So if I come down here to the bottom, I know that that's my last point there. And what happened here is my point type became undefined. So what I want to do is go ahead and set that to full super. And when I do, even though this says negative 6.6, I'm not sure why when we selected it in plan view, it showed negative 1.6. So, but when I do this, I set this to full super, then that will correct that in my plan view. So now if I close my editor, we'll see that the diagram dropped down to 6.6, that's full super there, and close that. And now when I select the end here, we'll see, hopefully that's visible on the screen share, that it's negative 6.6%. Okay, so now that we have our super elevation there, we can turn that off and we can kind of see the whole project. And I'll just save my settings for. And before we go ahead and switch over to our KM file or apply this to our corridor, let's take a look at the super elevation view. So when I select this, I can locate each section, and it's going to ask me which view I want to open it in. I can select a view here, and it'll open the super elevation view for me. And we can make other edits within this view. So when we were looking at the editor earlier, I could change, instead of changing things in the editor, I could come here and change this to 2% if I chose to. Yeah, and I can even select on one of the manipulators and move it, although graphically it's a little difficult because it's not showing you the actual element move until you do data points. So let me undo those. Okay, so we're back to normal. And you can look at that in for each curve set, or each super elevation section, I should say. The other way you could look at that is if you right click and hold down the right button, go to view controls, similar to how you might be using this for other 3D views or cross-section views, profile views. We can do a super elevation view, a plane and super elevation view. So then it says okay to create a dynamic super elevation view, and I'll select this middle section here and then select my view. So same thing goes on there. So we can look at each one, we can review the stations, or we can even change the stations there and do whatever you might want to do. So now we're ready to apply this to our corridor. So I'll save my settings, and I'm going to go open. Okay, so we have our corridor model file open, and you'll see, the corridor that I had created, and the same background image in my geometry files attached that I looked at previously. So the first thing we need to do is go ahead and attach the Superelevation file that we had just looked at or just created. And we'll go to roadway, base maps, and select my KS101. So as I mentioned earlier, when we use these commands, we're going to want to select the Superelevation sections that we created. So again, if you had a 2-lane section or a 3-lane section that was undivided, this would be much easier. These would be larger than the cross-section width itself. But because this median width is so wide, we would just want to be cautious of that. So these sections can sort of get lost within all the other elements there. So before I go ahead and get started with that, I'll take a look at my cross-section view, and I'm going to add a temporary dimension for kind of each piece of this here, for each lane and each shoulder. So you'll see as I add these, it's adding a dimension for the horizontal lane width as well as the normal cross slope that we defined in our template. And then for my last shoulder, I'm going to do 2 here, and one's going to be to my breakover or my rollover point, and the other will just be our, we'll do a total, actually I'll do 3, and then the third one will be there. Okay, so we have 3 lanes with our shoulders. Now we'll go to calculate, and we'll do assign superelevation to our corridor. So now what it's asking me to do is locate the first superelevation shape, and then I'm going to go ahead and do all 3 of these at one time. So I'll select the other 2 and then reset. And now it's asking me to locate the corridor. So I'll go ahead and just select one of the corridor handlebars here. Now it's prompted me to review the points that are associated with each lane. So I think I forgot to mention this earlier, but when we looked at the editor, when we create our lanes by the template, it gives it a name of the points. So you'll see these are the names from the points of my template. So that can be helpful in that you'll know which points are associated with it. Whereas this third lane or the auxiliary lane that I added that name in myself, and I may not know exactly which point unless I review my template. It's not as it's not as easy to see which points that those should be associated to. So yeah, it's 6 of one, half a dozen the other. It's going to end up being a preference of what you decide to do. So usually these are going to be good where they're at. And again, we can review these. If you need to change one, you will want to be real careful. So for example, this one, I have my left asphalt concrete surface course top EP2. As soon as I pick this drop-down menu though, that point changes. So if you just want to look at what's in this list, you're going to be careful. You got to be careful because it will change that for you. So I want to make sure I select the same point again. Now I do know that my right lane 3 here that I added does not have the correct points assigned to it. So I'm going to start from left to right, and so my pivot point is going to be my left edge of pavement. It's the right side, but it'll be the left inside edge of pavement line, and I have a lane line. Then I have my lane point and my edge of pavement. This actually needs to be, this is going to be lane 2. And then for my lane 3, it's going to be my pivot point will be my lane 2 point. And this should be correct to be an EP1. Okay, so now when I hit OK, this will go ahead and process and add the corridor or add the superelevation to this corridor. And it's going to take a couple minutes or so, depending on the size of your corridor. Okay, so there we see that their superelevation was applied. we see that in our cross-section view it already changed, and obviously that would mean that our 3D model has already changed as well. And if I just forward through a few of these, we'll get to the end where we get to a transition. So now we can see that we're starting to transition back to normal here, and our left lanes are back to 1.6, and our outside lanes are starting to get there. Now we're back to a normal section. And now that we're in this lane taper or a merge lane, and you'll see that the width is starting to change there as well, although it's maintaining the 1.6%. And since that ended within that full super, so let's go ahead and we'll just get back to there. We'll see that we're now starting to transition. Oh, and I got something weird going on with my shoulder there. So I'm not sure what's happening there, but for the sake of the demo, we'll say that that's how that's supposed to work. And I guess when I reviewed those points, I'm not quite sure why my point names didn't match the lane names there. Also, I was thinking about that as it was processing. I'd have to kind of review my template, see, but that's also just a good segue into making sure that as you name your points that they make sense for what you're trying to do, and that you'll know what those points mean later if you're not looking at the template itself. So. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of how to create your super elevation and apply it to your corridor. There's probably some other things you can do here that we did not review today, but as you get into it, feel free to reach out to our group if you have any questions. And whether you've created your sheets or not, or you've already cut your sheets, the super elevation changes should go ahead and automatically pull through to any sheets or sections that you might already cut. But if you were to want to add sections, maybe at some of those transition points or anything, you would need to recut your sheet models. So keep that in mind as you're working through this. So speaking of creating your or updating your sheets, if you were to do that, the sheet should automatically update, but any annotation would likely need to be removed and then re-annotated. So keep that in mind as well. The annotation will not dynamically update. So there are also two other things I just wanted to go over real quickly. When we create or add or apply the super elevation to the corridor, essentially what it's doing is creating point controls. And you may have noticed these magenta boxes on the dynamic cross-section view for each lane point here. So it's creating point controls, and we can review those a couple different ways by using the corridor objects dialog and locating our corridor. And if we look at the point control section, we'll see that all of these points were added as super elevation controls in the vertical mode. So it's controlling those points for you. And then you'll see the section name and the lane names over here for each one. Again, you want to keep in mind how you name these things and make sure they make sense so that if you're reviewing this portion of it later, you can do that and know where you're at and make sense of it, make heads or tails of all this information. So the other way you can review that is by going to the Explorer dialog and filtering through the corridor and looking at the point controls here. So you'll see all the same point controls we just looked at. And when you select one, the properties will appear in the properties dialog. And you'll see that it's a super elevation control. The second thing I wanted to show is that we can look at a super elevation report, and when we do that here, we can select our section or sections. So I'll select all three of these and reset to complete, and we're given our super elevation report. So there's a couple of different reports to choose from here, and you can review these, figure out which one might work best for what you're trying to look for. And the last one would be a CSV file, And this is the similar syntax to what you would want to see if you were creating or had created your own calcs and not wanted to let ORD calculate it. So you would build a CSV file in a similar format here, so that you could import those into your lanes that you had created. As I mentioned earlier, there is a separate video already on the wiki page for that. So if that's something you want to do, take a look at that video there. And also at the moment, there is not currently a way to generate a superelevation table that we would normally include in our plan sheet. So everyone has a different method to produce those, I'm sure. So you continue to follow through with those workflows. Last I saw, there was a presentation recently from Bentley where they are looking at or have maybe started to develop a way to create an annotation style table that could be generated. So we're going to take a look at that at some point, and if we can get that incorporated, if it makes sense for what the ODOT plans require. But that also leads us to the other question is, are these tables truly needed in our plan sets? And that's a question for another day. I mean, at this current time, yes, they still are needed to be included in the plans. But in the future, would maybe just one of these reports be sufficient? Is sort of the question that, the big picture question that we might have, rather than generating another table that needs to be included in the plans. Could we maybe just create one of these reports and submit those with the plans, like you might your pavement calculations or something like that? So. Okay, so it took a few minutes longer than I had hoped or anticipated, but that's what I have. So we'll open it up for any questions. Thanks, Kyle. Kyle just posted a link in the chat window there for the link to the CAD webinars, and as soon as that gets downloaded from the team site, we'll get that posted hopefully today. Well, that was actually at the beginning of the webinar. Sorry. So
yeah, no, that's right. I just tried to throw it out there in case anybody needed it. I can post it again, but we'll continue to upload all of our information there. There's also links to all the other videos are also from there as well. Inside our supplemental videos, there's a section for Superelevation, which I'll post that link right now. But I'll post that there.
All right, so the audience has been pretty quiet. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions, or post them in the chat window there. Kind of makes me nervous. There are no questions. Either it was confusing, or maybe I did that good of a job that it was super clear. So we'll see.
I think you did that good of a job, Matt.
All right, thanks, Kyle.
No, I like the example of adding the lane to it. That's something that we hadn't really touched on too much in previous trainings. So I thought that was a good example.
All right, thanks, Ian. All right, we'll hang out here for another minute or two and see if there's any questions. Feel free to let us know. Some questions that come later from Andrea. You're welcome.